There are stories that begin with silence, stories that are born in the stillness of the night, when the world seems too distracted to notice the small acts of courage that will later define everything. On one such night, in the heart of a city that never truly slept, a man named John walked his beat. He was a police officer, a protector, a man whose duty had long ago hardened his heart against the darkness he so often confronted. But what he did not know that night was that the darkness he was sworn to fight would lead him not only to save someone's life, but to discover something even greater, something that would change him forever. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that carried a faint promise of winter. Streetlights stretched long shadows over cracked sidewalks. John's boots tapped against the pavement in steady rhythm, his eyes scanning alleys and corners with the kind of sharpness only years on the force could teach. He had seen it all: petty thefts, broken families, desperate men pushed too far by poverty, women carrying the weight of worlds on their shoulders. He no longer startled at the sound of a shout or the distant wail of sirens. It was the job. It was his life. But tonight, something different waited for him. Samantha had just finished a long shift at work. She was exhausted, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her mind replaying deadlines, emails, and the silent dread of tomorrow's responsibilities. The streets were nearly empty, except for the occasional rush of cars and the flicker of neon lights from convenience stores. She tightened her grip on her purse as she walked, her heels clicking nervously against the concrete. She wasn't naive. She knew the city could turn cruel when you least expected it. But tonight she prayed she'd make it home without incident. Then, from the corner of her eye, movement. Two men stepped out from an alley, their faces shadowed, their bodies tense. Her breath caught in her throat as one of them whispered something to the other before approaching. She tried to walk faster, but their footsteps echoed behind her, growing closer. "Hey, lady," one of them called, his voice dripping with menace. "Hand over the bag." Her heart pounded. She froze, clutching her purse to her chest, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to go home. I don't have much." The men smirked. One lunged forward, grabbing her arm, and she let out a terrified scream. It was a sound that sliced through the night, a sound that would have gone unanswered, if not for John. John's head snapped up the moment he heard it. His instincts ignited like fire. He sprinted down the block, the radio at his side forgotten, his hand already hovering over his holster. As he rounded the corner, he saw them, the two men towering over a frightened young woman, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling. Without hesitation, he shouted, his voice booming like thunder. "Police! Step away from her!" The attackers spun around, startled, and in that moment of hesitation Samantha stumbled back, her breath sharp, her knees weak. John moved forward swiftly, authority in every step. One of the men cursed under his breath and raised a knife, the metal glinting under the streetlight. "Back off, cop!" The man snarled, but John didn't flinch. His hand moved faster than thought. With precision born from years of training, he disarmed the man in one swift motion, sending the knife clattering against the pavement. The other bolted, his footsteps echoing as he vanished into the night. The first man tried to run too, but John pinned him to the ground, his voice sharp, commanding him to stay down. And then silence. Just the heavy breathing of the officer and the frightened woman, and the faint buzz of the streetlight above them. John secured the assailant and radioed for backup, but his eyes kept drifting to Samantha. She stood a few feet away, shaken, her arms still wrapped protectively around herself as though to shield her from the world. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you, I thought." Her voice cracked, and she could not finish the sentence. John softened, his tone gentler now. "You're safe. You're going to be okay." When backup arrived and the attacker was taken away, John stayed behind, making sure Samantha could walk. He offered to call someone for her, but she shook her head. "I live just a few blocks from here. I can manage." But she couldn't hide the way her hands shook, the way her legs seemed unsteady. John, without hesitation, offered, "Let me walk you home, please, just until you're safe inside." Samantha hesitated, then nodded. Together they walked through the dim streets, the silence between them broken only by the distant hum of traffic. And though neither said much, something had already shifted in both of them. For John, it wasn't just another case, another citizen he had saved. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir beneath the armor of his uniform, something human and tender. And for Samantha, it wasn't just relief. It was a strange warmth, a feeling that even in her darkest moment, someone had appeared like light piercing the night. When they reached her apartment, she turned to him, her eyes still shining with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to," John replied softly. "Just take care of yourself." And yet, as he walked away, he couldn't help but glance back. And Samantha, standing at her doorway, did the same. Neither of them knew then what fate had set in motion. Neither of them could have guessed that a chance encounter on a dangerous night would be the spark of a love story neither had dared to dream. But destiny has a way of bringing two souls together when the world least expects it. And so, under the watchful glow of the city lights, the story of John and Samantha quietly began. The days after the incident were a blur for Samantha. She went back to work, sat at her desk, and tried to focus on numbers and emails, but her mind kept wandering back to that night. She could still feel the rough grip of the man who had cornered her, the cold edge of fear that had nearly suffocated her. Yet when she remembered, she also recalled something else, John. His voice, firm and unshakable, cutting through the darkness. His presence, strong and steady, that made her feel safe when she had never felt more vulnerable. Her friends noticed she was quieter, more thoughtful than usual. When they asked, she brushed it off. How could she explain that one man's courage had left an imprint on her heart? She didn't even know him beyond his first name. And yet, she couldn't forget. John, meanwhile, went back to his patrols, but his mind was no less distracted. He had seen countless victims before, people who needed saving, people who thanked him and disappeared back into their lives. That was the job. But Samantha had been different. The way her voice trembled, the way her eyes met his with both fear and gratitude. It had touched something inside him he didn't think was still alive. For days he found himself retracing his steps, hoping perhaps to cross paths with her again. He told himself it was just to check in, to make sure she was truly okay. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. And fate, it seemed, had its own plans. 1 week later, John was off duty, dressed not in his uniform but in jeans and a simple jacket. He stopped by a small cafe on the corner of the street near the station, a place he rarely had time to enjoy. As he walked in, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air. He stood in line, glancing around idly, until his eyes froze. There, at a small table by the window, sat Samantha. Her hair was tied back, her glasses perched on her nose, a notebook open in front of her. She was scribbling something absent-mindedly, her coffee cooling by her hand. John's breath caught for a moment. He hadn't expected this. He debated with himself. Should he approach her or let her be? But before he could decide, she looked up. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to still. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by surprise, and then something softer. "Officer John," she said, her voice carrying a smile, though she hadn't quite expected to see him again. He chuckled lightly, walking over. "Just John today. Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the seat across from her. "Please." And so, for the first time, they sat together not as a protector and a victim, but as two people, strangers who felt oddly familiar. Their conversation began cautiously. She thanked him again, though he waved it off. "I was just doing my job," he said, but she shook her head firmly. "No, you saved me. You didn't just stop them, you stayed until I was safe. That meant more than you realize." John felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected her to say that, and he didn't quite know how to respond. So instead, he asked about her. What did she do? Where was she from? Slowly, her laughter returned, her words flowing more easily as she told him about her work at a small design firm, her love of sketching, her dream of one day starting her own business. And she, in turn, asked about him. His stories weren't as lighthearted. Long nights, tough cases, the weight of responsibility. But she listened, really listened, as though every word mattered. When they finally left the cafe, the sun had already dipped lower in the sky. They walked together for a while until they reached the corner where their paths split. "It was nice," Samantha said, a little hesitant. "Seeing you again." "It was," John agreed, his lips curving into a rare smile. "Maybe we'll run into each other again." She nodded, though her eyes lingered on him a little longer before she turned to go. And John watched her walk away, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope. Over the next weeks, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes it was coincidence, sometimes not. Coffee shops turned into walks through the park. Small conversations turned into hours of sharing stories. Samantha found herself looking forward to those moments, to the way John's steady presence seemed to calm the noise in her life. And John, who had always kept his heart guarded, began to open up. He found himself telling her about his childhood, about the struggles that had pushed him toward becoming a police officer. He even admitted how lonely the job could be, how sometimes it felt like the world only saw the badge and not the man behind it. Samantha didn't judge. She understood, and in her understanding he found comfort. But beneath it all, both of them carried quiet fears. For Samantha, it was the fear of letting someone in, of trusting again after years of building walls. For John, it was the fear of failing someone he cared about, the fear that the dangers of his work would one day steal away any happiness he dared to claim. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, Samantha spoke softly, almost to herself. "I still think about that night, how close it was. If you hadn't been there..." Her voice trailed off. John turned to her, his gaze steady. "Don't think about what could have happened. Think about what did. You're here. You're safe." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment it was as though the city disappeared around them. And though neither said the words, both knew. Something deeper was growing between them. Something neither of them had planned, but neither could deny. What had begun as fear and protection was slowly, inevitably, becoming something far more powerful. And neither of them could stop it, even if they wanted to. John had been trained to face danger, but he hadn't been trained for the warmth he now felt every time Samantha's face appeared in his thoughts. For a man who had built his life on structure, rules, and service, the sudden tenderness that invaded his heart was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had saved lives before, stopped crimes in progress, and put himself in the line of fire countless times. Yet none of those moments had shaken his core the way Samantha's gentle smile had the night he walked her home. For Samantha, the days following the attempted robbery were strangely different. Normally, after such a frightening incident, fear would have consumed her, and she would have spent her days avoiding the streets, replaying the trauma in her head. But instead, she found herself remembering the steadiness of John's voice, the security in his eyes, and the almost invisible kindness he showed when he had checked her hands for tremors after the incident. She had always believed that heroes were distant figures found only in stories, but now one had walked beside her, flesh and blood, and something inside her shifted. The two began to exchange small messages. What started as polite check-ins from John, just to make sure Samantha was recovering emotionally, soon turned into longer conversations. They would speak about the simplest things, like her long shifts at the office and his exhausting patrols. Samantha confessed how lonely she sometimes felt, especially living in a city where everyone rushed past each other without a second glance. John, in return, admitted that being a police officer often meant carrying a weight others couldn't see, a silent burden that made him seem distant even when he was surrounded by people. Each word they shared built a fragile bridge between two worlds, hers filled with paperwork, late nights, and unspoken dreams, and his filled with sirens, unpredictability, and danger. And yet, on that bridge, they met halfway, discovering that beneath their differences, there was a resonance neither could ignore. One rainy afternoon, John found himself standing outside a small cafe near Samantha's office. He hadn't planned it, not really. He had been patrolling the area and noticed her sitting by the window, staring out at the raindrops chasing each other down the glass. She looked tired, perhaps from another long day, but there was something tender in the way she held her cup, as if she was gathering warmth not just from the coffee but from the moment itself. John hesitated. He had faced criminals with knives and guns without flinching, but the thought of walking into that cafe to say hello made his heart pound harder than any chase ever had. Finally, gathering courage, he pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly. Samantha's eyes lifted, and when they met his, her face lit up in a way that made every drop of rain outside seem irrelevant. "John?" she said, surprise mixed with joy. He smiled, his usual reserved expression softening. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check on you." They spent hours talking in that cafe, the world outside fading into a blur of gray while inside, colors bloomed in the space between them. They laughed about silly things, shared pieces of their past, and for the first time in a long while, Samantha felt truly seen. But life, as it always does, soon tested them. One evening, while Samantha was leaving work, she received a call from an unknown number. On the other end was a voice she instantly recognized, the same man who had tried to rob her that night. He had been released, his threats more venomous now, his anger directed not just at her but at John too. Fear gripped her chest as he promised revenge, his words dripping with malice. Shaken, she immediately called John. Within minutes, he was by her side, his presence steadying her trembling form. He reassured her, told her that she was safe, that he would handle everything. Yet deep down, John knew the situation was dangerous. Criminals who held grudges often acted irrationally, and now it wasn't just about him, it was about Samantha too. The following days were tense. Samantha tried to keep her life as normal as possible, but the shadow of the threat lingered in every step she took. John increased his patrols around her neighborhood, often parking his cruiser nearby, keeping watch. To Samantha, it was both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because she knew she was protected, heartbreaking because she realized the risks John faced every day. One night, as she sat across from him at her small kitchen table, Samantha finally voiced what had been pressing on her heart. "John, why do you do this? Why put yourself in danger for people who don't even know your name?" "For me." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. John leaned back, his gaze steady but filled with a softness that made her chest tighten. "Because if I don't, who will? Everyone deserves to feel safe, Samantha. Everyone deserves to walk home without fear. And as for you," he paused, his voice dropping slightly, "for you, I'd do it 1,000 times over." The silence that followed was thick, charged with emotions neither had the courage to fully name yet. But in that silence, Samantha knew that something irreversible had taken root between them. The threat eventually resurfaced. John received word that the man who had attacked Samantha was planning something reckless, gathering others with him. The danger was real, and John's instincts screamed at him to act quickly. On the night it all unfolded, Samantha insisted on staying at her apartment, despite John's urging to relocate temporarily. "I can't run from this forever," she told him. "But I trust you." Those words struck John with more force than any weapon could. He realized then that his duty was no longer just about protecting a citizen. It was about protecting the woman who had quietly become his heart's anchor. The confrontation came in the dark of night. John and his fellow officers intercepted the group near Samantha Street, a clash of chaos and resolve. In the midst of it all, John's thoughts weren't on his own safety but on Samantha, who waited in her apartment, unaware of the storm raging just outside. When it was over, when the criminals were finally subdued, John stood under the streetlights, his uniform damp with sweat, his body aching from the fight. But as he looked up at Samantha's window and saw the faint glow of her lamp, relief washed over him. She was safe. Moments later, she came running outside, her face pale but her eyes locked on him. Without caring about who was watching, she threw her arms around him, her tears soaking his shoulder. "You kept your promise," she whispered. John held her close, his own voice rough with emotion. "I always will." From that night onward, their bond deepened in ways neither of them had expected. They weren't just two strangers whose lives had crossed by chance. They were two souls who had been tested by fear, danger, and vulnerability, and had chosen to stand together. Love, they discovered, doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it sneaks in through the cracks of chaos, weaving itself into the moments where trust is tested and courage is revealed. For John and Samantha, love was born not in the safety of certainty, but in the fire of adversity. And as they walked forward, hand in hand, neither knew exactly where the path would lead. But one thing was certain. Their story had only just begun, and the ending, whatever it would be, was already brighter than either of them could have imagined. In the weeks that followed the night of the confrontation, Samantha and John slipped into an unspoken rhythm, one that neither of them had anticipated yet both welcomed with a quiet eagerness. Samantha found herself looking for his car outside her apartment, a silent reassurance that he was there, watching over her. John, in turn, grew used to checking his phone after long shifts, hoping to see a message from her. Even if it was just a simple good morning. The city around them didn't slow down. Sirens still screamed, crime still unfolded, and John still wore the weight of his uniform like armor. But something inside him had changed. His world had always been painted in shades of duty and danger, a constant balancing act between sacrifice and survival. Now, Samantha's presence introduced new colors, soft shades of comfort, trust, and an unfamiliar longing that made even the harshest nights feel bearable. Samantha, on the other hand, wrestled with her own contradictions. She had always been independent, used to solving her problems on her own, and hesitant to let anyone too close. But John's presence had dismantled the walls she had built over the years. When he looked at her, it wasn't just with admiration. It was with understanding, as if he could see the pieces of herself she usually kept hidden from the world. And yet, alongside the warmth of growing affection came the whisper of fear. Loving a man like John meant loving a life filled with risk, unpredictability, and danger. Could her heart bear the weight of that? One evening, as they walked side by side through the quiet streets, Samantha finally voiced what had been pressing in her chest. The night was cool, the glow of streetlights casting golden halos around them. She stopped, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag, and turned to face him. "John," she began softly, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "Do you ever think about how dangerous this is? Your job, every day you step into the unknown. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how I could." She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. John studied her, the lines of his face illuminated by the flickering light above. "Every day I think about it," he admitted, his voice low and honest. "Every time I put on this uniform, I know there's a chance I might not come back. But I also know that if I don't do it, someone else's life might be at risk. It's not easy, Samantha. It never will be. But when I see the people I've helped, when I see you safe after that night," he paused, his gaze softening, "that's what makes it worth it." Her heart ached at his words, torn between admiration and fear. "But what about you? Who protects you?" she whispered. His lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that carried both strength and vulnerability. "I never thought I needed anyone to, until now." That confession lingered in the air between them, heavy and tender all at once. Samantha felt the weight of it settle deep inside her, an acknowledgement that their lives were already intertwined in ways neither of them had fully realized. Days turned into weeks, and their bond only grew stronger. They began sharing pieces of their worlds with each other. John would sometimes pick Samantha up from work, leaning casually against his cruiser as she walked out of the office, earning curious glances from her coworkers. Samantha, in turn, introduced him to the small rituals of her life. Quiet dinners, favorite books, the little bakery she visited every Saturday morning. Yet beneath the blossoming affection, doubt still flickered in the corners of their hearts. For John, the fear was simple but profound. What if his life of danger pulled Samantha into harm's way again? What if one day, the call came that he couldn't answer, and she was left with nothing but memories of promises he couldn't keep? For Samantha, the fear was equally sharp. Could she truly open her heart to a man who lived each day on the edge of uncertainty? The turning point came on a night neither of them expected. John had just finished a particularly grueling shift, one filled with tension and chaos. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, when he found himself outside Samantha's apartment. He hadn't planned to stop by, he just needed to see her, to remind himself why he kept fighting through the darkness. When she opened the door, her face lit up with surprise and concern. "John, you look worn out. Come in." He stepped inside, the warmth of her home wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to let go, to sit on her couch and breathe without the weight of the badge pressing down on him. Samantha watched him silently for a moment, then gently placed a blanket over his shoulders. "You don't always have to be strong, you know," she whispered. The words broke something inside him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. "Sometimes I feel like I'm carrying the whole city on my back," he admitted, his voice raw. "And then I see you, and for a moment, it feels like I don't have to carry it alone. But that scares me, Samantha, because what if I can't protect you? What if loving me puts you in danger again?" Her heart clenched at his confession, but instead of recoiling, she reached out and took his hands in hers, gently pulling them away from his face. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "John, you don't have to protect me from everything. I know what your life is, and I choose to be here. Not because it's safe, but because it's real, and because it's with you." Her words sank into him like a balm, soothing wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. For the first time in years, John felt the walls he had built around his heart crumble completely. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if letting go would mean losing the only light he had ever truly known. From that night on, there was no denying it. They were in love. Not the kind of love born from fleeting glances or surface attraction, but the kind forged in fear, trust, and vulnerability. It was a love that demanded courage, the kind that made every day worth fighting for, even when the world seemed determined to test them. Still, challenges remained. John's schedule was unpredictable, and there were nights when Samantha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was safe. There were days when John felt torn between duty and the desire to be by her side. But each time doubt crept in, they found strength in the quiet moments they shared, the laughter over simple dinners, the comfort of silent walks, the way their hands fit together perfectly. One evening, as they stood on Samantha's balcony, looking out at the sprawling city lights, John spoke words that marked a turning point in their journey. "Samantha," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of both fear and hope. "I don't know what tomorrow holds. I can't promise that danger won't come again, but I can promise you this. I will fight for us, no matter what, and I don't want to imagine a future that doesn't have you in it." Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear but of overwhelming love. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, and whispered, "Then let's face tomorrow together." In that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city, with the stars hidden behind the glow of street lamps, John and Samantha sealed an unspoken vow. Their love was not fragile. It was resilient, born in the shadows but destined to shine. And as the night stretched on, the world below them carried on with its chaos, its dangers, its unpredictability. But for John and Samantha, standing side by side, the future felt like something worth fighting for, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because love, they realized, wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about finding someone to stand with you in the rain, someone who made the fear bearable and the unknown a little less daunting. And in each other, they had found exactly that. The city was alive with tension. Whispers of crime rings spreading their reach had filtered through the precinct, and John felt the shift in the air like a storm building just beyond the horizon. For weeks, his unit had been investigating a string of robberies, calculated, dangerous, and escalating in violence. John had thrown himself into the case, knowing that one wrong step could spell disaster for innocent lives. But what he didn't know was that fate was about to entwine this case with the woman he loved most. It began on an ordinary Thursday evening. Samantha had stayed late at her office, finishing a project under the dim glow of her desk lamp. By the time she packed her bag and stepped into the night, the streets were quieter than usual, the hum of the city subdued. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. She was halfway to her car when she heard it, the low murmur of voices behind her. The sound made her stomach tighten. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder to see two men lurking in the shadows, their eyes fixed on her. Fear surged through her veins, memories of the first time she'd been attacked flashing through her mind. Her heart pounded as she tried to remain calm, fumbling with her keys. But before she could reach the safety of her car, one of the men stepped forward, blocking her path. "Pretty late to be out alone," he sneered, his voice oily and threatening. Samantha froze, clutching her bag like a shield. "Please, I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice trembling. The second man circled around, cutting off her escape. "Maybe we just want to talk," he said with a twisted smile. But this wasn't random. These men weren't opportunists. They were part of the same crew John's unit had been tracking, the crew who had already left behind a trail of fear in the city. And now, by cruel coincidence, Samantha had crossed their path. As panic consumed her, Samantha remembered John's words, the way he had told her to trust her instincts, to never stop fighting. She reached for her phone, desperate to call him, but one of the men snatched it from her hand and hurled it to the ground, shattering it against the pavement. "Not so fast," he hissed. Fear gripped her like ice, but before the situation could spiral further, headlights suddenly swept across the lot. Car pulled in fast, tires screeching. The doors flung open, and out stepped John. His eyes blazing, his gun drawn, his entire presence radiating controlled fury. "Step away from her," he commanded, his voice thunderous in the night. The men faltered, taken aback by the sudden intrusion, but they didn't retreat. Instead, one of them smirked, pulling a knife from his pocket. "Looks like we've got ourselves a hero." John's grip on his weapon tightened. His heart raced, not from fear for himself, but from the sight of Samantha standing frozen, her eyes wide with terror. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not tonight, not ever. What followed unfolded in a blur of adrenaline. The men lunged, and John reacted with the precision of a seasoned officer. A shot rang out, shattering the tension, and the knife clattered to the ground. The other man scrambled, but backup sirens wailed in the distance, John's call for reinforcement already racing toward them. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with officers, the attackers cuffed and shoved into squad cars. Samantha stood trembling, her breath shallow and shaky, as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her. John rushed to her side, holstering his weapon as he gathered her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, but, John, if you hadn't been here." "Don't," he cut in, pulling her close, his heart pounding against hers. "I'll always be here." That night, back at her apartment, Samantha sat curled on the couch with John beside her, his arm around her shoulders. The fear was still raw, but so was the gratitude, the overwhelming relief that he had come when she needed him most. But the incident left a shadow. It wasn't just about the danger she had faced. It was about what it meant for their future. For Samantha, it was a stark reminder that loving John came with risks she couldn't control. For John, it was confirmation of his deepest fear, that his world would inevitably spill into hers, no matter how hard he tried to shield her. For days afterward, they walked on edge. Samantha avoided being alone after dark, and John's protective instincts surged to new heights. But beneath it all lay an unspoken question. Could they truly build a life together when danger was always lurking? The tension reached its breaking point one evening when John arrived at Samantha's apartment after a long shift. She was pacing the living room, her eyes clouded with worry. "John, we need to talk," she said firmly. He closed the door behind him, his stomach sinking at the tone in her voice. "What is it?" Her gaze locked onto his, filled with love but also with pain. "I don't know if I can do this. Not because I don't love you. I do. More than I ever thought possible. But every time you walk out that door, I don't know if you'll come back. And now, after what happened, it feels like I'm living in constant fear. John's chest tightened, her words cutting deeper than any wound he'd ever sustained on duty. Samantha, I understand. I've thought the same thing 1,000 times. But I don't know how to be anyone else. This job, it's who I am. Protecting people. It's all I've ever known. Her eyes glistened with tears. And what if protecting others means losing you? What then? The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, the love they shared felt fragile, like glass caught between two trembling hands. John stepped closer, his voice breaking with emotion. I don't have all the answers, but what I do know is that loving you is the only thing that makes all of this worth it. Without you, none of it means anything. Samantha's tears spilled over, her heart torn between fear and longing. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the love that had become the most precious part of her life. But the question of survival loomed like a storm cloud, refusing to be ignored. That night, they held each other in silence, both knowing that their love had been tested in ways neither of them expected, and both wondering if the future they dreamed of was truly possible. But what neither of them realized was that the hardest test was still to come. A test that would either shatter them completely or bind them together in a way no force on earth could ever break. Because love, like the job John had devoted his life to, wasn't about certainty. It was about sacrifice, trust, and the courage to hold on even when the world tried to pull you apart. And soon, they would discover just how much they were willing to fight for each other. The weeks after the attack were a blur of emotions, tangled between fear, love, and uncertainty. Samantha had never questioned her feelings for John. Her heart belonged to him entirely, but the shadow of his dangerous life as a police officer loomed over her like a storm that refused to pass. John, too, carried his own torment, torn between the oath he had sworn to protect others and the vow he longed to make to Samantha, to protect her heart forever. They both knew they were standing at a crossroads. The turning point came one chilly evening when John received word of a major operation. The robbery crew that had threatened Samantha had resurfaced, planning what could be their most dangerous strike yet. Intelligence suggested they were targeting a heavily populated downtown bank. John's unit was tasked with intercepting them before tragedy could unfold. When John got the call, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. But this time, something was different. This wasn't just about duty, it was personal. He knew these men had already tried to harm Samantha. If they succeeded with this heist, countless lives would be destroyed. He grabbed his gear, but before leaving, he stopped at Samantha's apartment. She opened the door, her face softening when she saw him, though the worry never left her eyes. "You're leaving again," she whispered, reading everything in his stance. John nodded. "It's them, Samantha, the crew. We've got a chance to stop them tonight." Her breath hitched. She wanted to beg him not to go, to choose her over the badge. But looking into his eyes, she saw the fire that had drawn her to him in the first place. The man she loved was built for this, built to protect. She couldn't take that from him, not without destroying the very essence of who he was. So instead, she stepped closer, placing her trembling hand against his chest. "Then promise me you'll come back." John swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I promise, because there's nothing I want more than to build a life with you. When this is over, no more running, no more fear. I'll ask you the question I should have asked a long time ago." Her eyes widened, tears glimmering as she whispered, "Then I'll wait for you." With that, he kissed her, deep, fierce, filled with all the words they couldn't say. And then he left, the sound of the door closing echoing like thunder in her heart. The operation unfolded under the cover of night. The streets were crawling with tension as John and his team positioned themselves around the bank. Inside, the crew had already taken control, their weapons aimed at terrified hostages. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos, one wrong move away from disaster. John's eyes scanned the scene through the window, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being screamed that failure wasn't an option. Not just for the innocents trapped inside, but for Samantha, for the future they deserved. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours. Demands were shouted, Negotiations faltered, and the threat of violence grew heavier with each passing minute. Finally, John saw an opening, a moment where hesitation could mean everything. He acted. Storming into the bank with his team, John moved with precision and courage. Gunfire erupted, chaos exploding in every direction. He shielded hostages, disarmed attackers, fought with every ounce of strength in his body. At one point, he found himself face to face with the same man who had held Samantha at knife point weeks before. Their eyes locked, hatred burning between them. The fight was brutal, but John refused to falter. Every punch, every block, every desperate maneuver was fueled by one thought: I have to make it home to her. When the dust finally settled, the crew was subdued, the hostages freed, and the threat eliminated. John stood in the wreckage, his chest heaving, his body bruised but unbroken. Relief washed over him, but it was incomplete because he knew the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part was finding Samantha again. Hours later, when he finally appeared at her door, Samantha's heart stopped. He looked exhausted, his uniform torn, but he was alive. Alive and standing there with eyes that told her everything she needed to know. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest. "You kept your promise," she whispered. John held her tight, his voice low but steady. "And now it's time I keep another one." He pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, retrieving a small velvet box. Samantha's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth as he dropped to one knee right there in her living room, still in his battered uniform. "Samantha, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I can't promise a life without challenges, without risks. But I can promise this: I will love you, protect you, and fight for us every single day. You are my reason, my anchor, my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, her chest swelling with emotions too big for words. She dropped to her knees with him, cupping his face in her hands. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, John. 1,000 times yes." The kiss they shared then was unlike any before. It wasn't born of fear or desperation, but of certainty, of a love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Months later, their wedding day arrived. It was simple, intimate, filled with laughter and tears. Friends and family gathered to witness what they already knew: that John and Samantha had found in each other something rare, something worth every struggle they'd endured. As Samantha walked down the aisle, John's eyes welled with tears. He had faced death, fear, and doubt, but none of it compared to the beauty of this moment, of seeing the woman he loved walking toward him, not as someone he needed to protect, but as his equal, his partner, his forever. When they exchanged vows, their voices trembled with emotion. "Through danger and peace, through fear and hope," John whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. "I am yours." "And I am yours," Samantha replied, her smile radiant through her tears. The crowd erupted in joy as they sealed their vows with a kiss, the weight of their journey melting into the promise of a new beginning. Later that night, as they danced under the stars, Samantha leaned her head against John's shoulder. "You know," she murmured, "if someone had told me the night I was attacked that it would lead me here, I never would have believed it." John chuckled softly, tightening his hold on her. "Life has a funny way of turning pain into something beautiful. As long as we're together, I don't care where the road takes us." And so, their story, born from fear and struggle, tested by danger and doubt, ended not in tragedy, but in triumph. For love, when it is real, has the power to endure anything. And for John and Samantha, it was only the beginning.